Hosting broadcast. Okay, buddy, we're not live now. So this is Mike Osborne from Proball having a conversation with Boti. Now, I won't say your surname, Boti, because I've heard many versions of it. So how do you pronounce your surname?
It's spelled Nagy. It's a Hungarian name, and it's pronounced Nagy. As with every language, it has its own nuance, and Hungarian has the A is always pronounced as a O sound, just like the A in an English word like what or swan. It's got an O sound, and GY is a J, which just like in English, you've got a GH can be an F sound like rough or tough. So it's a nuance to the language. The GY is a J, so you've got Nagy. Even though it looks like Nagy, I get Nagy, I get Nagy, I get people who think it's exotic, so they think it's something different, so they go Naj. I get all kinds of stuff, but it's Naj. And what makes it difficult, though, is that a lot of second and third generation folk with that name have anglicised it, and they're happy to go with Nagy or whatever they choose to call it, Nagy or Naji or whatever they want. So that's what I think makes it a little bit more complicated than what it should be. It really is just Nodge.
Okay, so you've indicated in your answer there that you are an alien to Australia, long-term alien.
Yes.
So you you were born in Australia, or your parents?
Absolutely. I was born in Australia. My parents left Hungary during the Second World War, came to Australia via a migrant situation in Bavaria in Germany, and then my father had the opportunity to take the family to the United States, Canada, New Zealand or Australia, and he thought Australia was about as far away as you could get from the communist over Hungary, so that's why he chose Australia. He saw it as a young, exciting country and a place where, bear in mind, I would be born here and become his 8th kid. So at that stage he had 7, and he thought this would be a great place to raise a young family, and he was correct. Of course, it was in those 50s and 60s. It was perfect for that. We originally came to a migrant camp in Greta, which is somewhere on the other side of the Blue Mountains towards Singleton, and that's where I was born. So I'm an Australian. Boti Nagy, that's about as Australian as you can get.
And I think Australia is much the richer for your family having made that journey. And I'm probably referring to your other siblings rather than yourself here. But
Yeah, sure.
I do recollect, Boti, that your family have quite a rich history in basketball. So you were probably born up with it in the cradle. What's your first memory of basketball in your life?
My parents had a very good friend called Loisy Ugadi, and he was a basketball coach. And so, because the Hungarian community and in a lot of communities, the Latvians, the Polish, the various communities that were set up in various parts of Australia, where people of the same nationality gathered. So the Hungarians were no different. They gathered in Adelaide, and so this particular man, Mr. Ugadi, Loisy as we call him, he noticed that Dad had some fairly tall sons and suggested basketball was the way to go. So he got my brothers and my sister and my father actually involved in basketball. Dad became an administrator. And basically I just followed suit. My own memories are of our big backyard, because we were fortunate enough to have 2 houses, because as I said, there were 8 kids. We had 2 houses side by side in Hyde Park, knocked the fence down and had a very big backyard where we put up a basketball ring and a keyway, and pretty much we had about a half court. So there was quite a bit of activity there on a regular basis with everybody. And because we had some lighting outside as well, there were annual club functions where the Budapest Club would have a function, sort of like a big barbecue thing, a dance, a social, a gathering, and people would come to our place. And then South Adelaide might have one there as well, and come to the Nodge's backyard. And my first recollection is as a very little boy talking to people like Michael Armatt and Werner Lind and people of that ilk, who were the stars of the early and mid and late 60s, who were just people I met in my backyard.
And I seem to remember I did have one of your brothers, I think, was about the same age as myself, but I do remember one of your other brothers being famously linked to a hole in the wall in what was then the referee's room. Would you care to expand on that?
Well, sure. My oldest brother Arkush was a referee. He went down the path of refereeing in the early '60s and was a very good referee. I think Lyle Clift was the #1 referee back in those days, and my brother Arkush was about second. Now then comes the players, the brothers that played, and that was Chobber, who was the oldest, and he had a little bit of white line fever. He wasn't a dirty player by any stretch of the imagination, but he was an intense player. He was a player that if there was a loose ball rolling, he would dive on it. He didn't care about skinning his knees or anything. And then there was my brother Geza, who was a centre at 6'4", and Hubba, who was a forward at 6'3", and Sitcho, who was a guard at 6'2". They're all sort of coming down in height. And I think Chobber felt a older brother responsibility, so that if anyone roughed up one of his brothers, he would mete out the appropriate. And as a result of that, he got a little bit of a reputation, which was a little bit warranted and a little bit not. If you met him now, he's just the loveliest man you could hope to meet. And but he had a few referees that tended to be worried about him, and they would give him fouls very, very quickly. And there was a particular time when he was absolutely frustrated by the number of fouls he chalked up in a very short period of time. And after the game, when they were walking to the change rooms, they walked past the referee's room, and I think he just really wanted to say hello, but the door was shut.
And that door didn't remain shut. It didn't remain shut for very long. I do remember that. But Boti, you also remember that you played quite a bit as a underage or junior player until I think you had quite a bad knee injury. So how did your playing career pan out?
I was really lucky that I had these brothers, and the people they mixed with were the elite of the game in South Australia at that time. So I got to work out and watch a lot of the great players playing, and I spent a lot of time in the backyard with a brother or another, one showing me this particular set of skills, because my brother Sitcher, he was the under-18 state captain at the time and was a feisty sort of point guard type of player, so working at those sort of things. And then Geza was always, he's a very shrewd player. He was always showing me little tricks of the trade, such as when a player is shooting and you're playing defense and you can't get to him, you can just run past him and just clip the elbow. Referee never sees that if your arm doesn't change direction, and it puts the shooter right off. They would give me these little tips, and Hubba was inspirational because he was always out the backyard working on that jump shot pretty much every spare minute he had. So I felt I got the benefit of a little bit of everything from him, and so I was coming through juniors quite nicely. I had a few good years in juniors. I made a state team in under-20s where I was the backup centre for Andy Campbell, of all things. He was 7'2" and I was 6'2". Yeah, it was a big drop. And then the year after I started playing district, I tore my knee up pretty dramatically on a bit of Coke on the side of the court. Back in those days, they had those little corrugated cups of Coke. Someone obviously was walking with about 4 or 5 in their hands. They must have spilt a bit onto the floor. No one noticed it. Got sticky, and as I was running, it was exactly the spot where I put my foot and then twisted to play defense on someone that was going the other direction. And my sole of my foot stayed where it was, and my knee just turned around at an unnatural angle. And those were the days when words like knee reconstruction back in 1974, that wasn't part of the language. So I was pretty happy to be walking again after being in plaster from the top of my leg to my ankle for a better part of 2 months. Things have sure changed.
So there we lost clearly we lost a major National League player in the majors. But while we lost the National League player, we did gain I'm not sure what word to describe you, Boti, because your longevity in the game as a journalist, your passion for the game, which seems to be unwavered for the last 40 years, the depth of your knowledge and recall, it's almost like you have a photographic memory. How did you get into this game of journalism, and particularly with basketball, which was not a mainstream sport by any stretch of the imagination, but in those early years you always seemed to tease out a bit of space for the sport in the news at that time. So how did that begin?
All right, don't confuse a wealth of knowledge with just an ability to retain stupid trivia, because I can give you and so I'm not sure I have a photographic memory. I just remember stupid things, all kinds of very foolish things. It was sort of, I wrote my first story in January of 1974, on January the 9th, and it was about Ken Burbridge, who was a star player in Victoria at the time with, I think he was playing for Coburg Giants at that time. He was entertaining the idea of coming over to Adelaide as a playing coach, and so that was the first story I had with a byline on it. In January the 9th, 1975. I just looked that up a little while ago. And so I'm coming up on 40 years. I just love the sport, and I've always believed in the sport. And I think if you believe in something, then you also believe, by believing in its worth, you also must have faith in other people to ultimately recognize its worth. And I had a friend I went to school with, and I said to him, basketball one day will be a really big sport in this country. And he said, no, you're crazy. And I said, no, I think it will be. I think people will warm to it if it's done right. And I think that's what we saw with the NBL. It was started with all the right intentions, and it grew. In fact, it grew so massively that it outgrew its ability to run itself. That's essentially what happened. And the best people we had in the sport at the time running it got picked off by other sports that were threatened by us. And it seems ridiculous today to consider that the AFL may have been remotely threatened by basketball. But it was a little bit, only to the extent that we might have been pinching the AFL on the backside, nothing more than that, but they did sort of go, okay, we need to knock off their media manager, and that's what they did. They recruited the really good media manager that the NBL had at the time. Bill Palmer, who was the general manager, he got knocked off by the NRL. He got a position with the NRL. And Mal Speed, who sat there as the chairman through the what would we call the halcyon years. He became he was headhunted again. Well, that's what I mean by knocked off. Headhunted by the Australian Cricket Board, and ended up running the ICC there for a while. So we had good people running the sport, and the sport just took off. And I always believed that was going to happen. I thought the spectacular nature of the sport, and the fact that it's confined in this area where you can fit lots of people around it, and it's indoors, and it's family friendly. It just lent itself to being a success. I get frustrated at the extent to which the sport's been mismanaged over a number of years in different ways that have prevented it from actually really flourishing and booming in the way that I think it has the potential to. And I'll never stop believing that. And I'm looking at what I'm thinking at the moment, Mike, is the second coming of the NBL. There's some great players coming back into the league, Australians as well as imports, and we sort of, I think we're coming out of a trough, but it's going to take a while for the world at large to recognise that. So,
well, buddy, I know we have different experiences in the sport the last 20 years, but being in the basketball uniform business, people keep saying to me that surely it's a dying sport or it's declining, and I don't see that at all. In fact, there are pockets of the sport that have simply boomed, whereas before it was the basketball associations, the schools were not very heavily involved at all, but now they want the gear, they want to look the part, they have programs, both not only the private schools, but the state schools. So I see at the grassroots level, it's been growing, and the interest in the NBA is massive. It's just at that top level that it needs just a bit of a kick along to keep it going.
And unfortunately, in the mainstream world, you're judged by your top level. So right now, if I was to say to you, what's the state of Aussie rules football at grassroots level, you probably wouldn't know. But we do know that in the last 20 years, there's definitely been a groundswell against Aussie rules football with a lot of, you read these anecdotal things of mothers not wanting their sons to play that rough football sport. So on the grassroots level, it may not be as rosy as it is for basketball. But who cares? The AFL is the best thing on all winter. We want to watch AFL matches. You judge the sport by its elite competition. Right now you can say, well, the AFL's taken a little bit of a slump because the advent of teams like Gold Coast and Greater Western Sydney has spread the talent a bit thin, and we've seen a lot more massacres in the last 2 or 3 years than we probably have previously. But nonetheless, the AFL is booming. It's absolutely booming. And you judge football by how that's going. You judge rugby by how the NRL is going. And so you judge basketball by how the NBL is going. So when the NBL is going poorly, as it has been for close to a decade, that's how sports judge. So it doesn't matter that we have 1.1 million participants in the sport, or that we're top 10 in the world, and possibly the only nation that's top 10 in the world for its senior men, senior women, junior men, junior women, wheelies, disabled. Like, if you put it all together, Australia is the only country that's top 10 rated by FIBA in everything. So these are wonderful things, but what do they mean to a punter who doesn't follow our sport? It means nothing. How's that NBL going? Is that still going? Because it doesn't seem to be happening, and it's been the fact that a lot of our best administrators were headhunted, and that we kind of lost our way as a sport. We fell into the trap of the lowest common denominator, and by that I mean playing styles of basketball that will be successful, but will turn off the casual spectator. The die-hard, the committed basketball fan, he'll still be there, she'll still be there, but the casual spectator won't come to watch what, say, Perth and New Zealand dished up in last year's grand final series, where in game 2 it's 29 all at half time. I mean, unless you're a real basketball fan, you just don't want to watch that. And so that's how we're judged. That's why I'm happy at the moment. I'm very happy at the moment, because our NBL has got James Ennis in it. It's got Sam Young coming in it today. Mustafa Farrakhan came into it with Melbourne Tigers. These are guys with good pedigree, good resumes, and you sort of go, okay, our league's looking good. AJ Ogilvy, he's a damn good player. Mark Worthington came back from Serbia. He's a damn good player. We've now got a competition that's worth going to see again. Now it's just a matter of getting that message across again.
Boti, I have to hold you there, because clearly the passion for the game runs through your veins, but this interview or this conversation is largely about your career as a journalist.
I didn't know that.
Yes, it's later on when we have our conversations with NBL coaches, players, NBA coaches, players, etc. We'll get into that those areas. But at the moment, as a journalist, you're originally from a very minor sport, trying to battle for space and time. Probably one of the few journalists in Australia that's stayed the course and the time. What things in journalism, particularly with the basketball side of things, are you the most proud of?
Well, probably the fact that I've stuck with it, that I love it enough to stick with it. I look at a lot of my contemporaries and a lot of people who I respected or have respected in the sport and do respect in the sport. People like Grantley Bernard, Chris Appleby. These are Melbourne journalists who covered basketball. They went on to bigger and better things, and I probably had more than one opportunity to do something bigger and better, but I chose not to, because I don't think I could have the passion for Aussie rules. I don't think I have the passion for soccer that I have for basketball. So I wanted to stay with the game for as long as I can. And now what's happened, just by attrition and other people falling by the wayside, I'm one of the few that has stayed the course, and therefore has got recall and some sort of historical perspective on the game. And I feel it's an obligation. I almost feel like as a writer, I'm a custodian of the history of the game, so that when someone like Ian Davies or Ken Richardson, who have passed away in the past couple of weeks, when they do leave us, that I think it's important to acknowledge exactly what their contribution was. And I'm very proud to be able to do that, and that is the thing I probably take most seriously, preserving the history and making sure that today's generation doesn't just think that basketball began when the NBL began or when the WNBL began, but recognise that there were lots of other names, lots of other great players, lots of eras before we got to where we are now. I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but as you can probably tell, I don't want to leave the sport. I've had opportunities. I've turned them down.
No, you are straying a little bit. But I think because I first stumbled back on you because of your blog. And the articles that interested me largely were clearly because of my age, some of the archival materials. But in asking around, it seems to me that you've struck a bit of a chord with people because the readership is really quite significant. And I think because you do cover, the WNBL, the NBL, the state scene, the local scene, the history of the game. And I think that's the appeal that your blog will have for people because you cover all things and you're not constrained by space and time. Well, maybe time, but not space.
Time is a killer. And when I forget to, it doesn't matter. There's stuff. Today I've been working on a blog and I forgot to save it and I lost it all. Just before this interview, very frustrating. It's really hard to be right now. But yeah, look, I did my training as a journalist at the newspaper, which was an afternoon newspaper, and I went through all the general stages that we used to do back in those days. You'd spend 3 months in a department, and then they'd be moved to another department for 3 months, so that you got a really good cross section of how to be a writer and how to be a journalist. The most interesting 3 months I had personally was when I was at the law courts, and because that just happened to coincide with the Truro trials. I'm sure you remember them. I'm not sure how many people that watch this will know what I'm talking about.
I think most people will.
Okay, so I was lucky enough, when I say lucky enough, it was a morbid time, but I was lucky enough to be there when it was a really active situation, front page stories. My first front page story was a court story when a detective named Sam Bass shot a suspected drug felon at the Arkaba by the name of Tony Esposito. It's like yesterday to me. See, here's what I mean. I can remember trivia, Michael. I don't know what that is, but I remember trivia. And like those 3 months in courts were terrific. If I had a choice, I couldn't do basketball. It would have been to be a court reporter because there was always something interesting going on, always good stories going on. And for my other passion, which is writing and to be an author, those sorts of stories would have been invaluable. So I did my 3 months there, and then I did my 3 months in sport. And it was around about that time that I tore up my knee, and the opportunity to be the full-time basketball writer. Well, I had already been doing it, which was awkward when you're playing. Pat Micken, when she was working for the Advertiser, would have experienced the same thing. It's awkward when you're playing to write about the competition that you're playing in, because you're compromised. And I never played a good enough game to be able to warrant saying anything about myself, but I did see Pat once have that awkward situation where she went for 25 points and say a dozen rebounds, and she had to write about how well she played under her line. I was never caught in that situation before, probably because I wasn't good enough. But when I got hurt, that meant that I could actually focus a bit more on being a basketball writer for the news. And I was doing that in concert with other duties that I had, so that wasn't full time. And then in 1990, the Advertiser newspaper, which was then shortly after taken over by News Limited as it was, they headhunted me to write basketball exclusively for them. So that was something I jumped at, the opportunity to do that.
But also, Boti, from my knowledge of some of your work, you have two other bits of work, one about a local basketball player and another piece of work which is entirely divorced from basketball. Would you tell us about those two projects?
I've had two basketball books. One was in the wake of the girls' performances at 19 '88 Olympics in Seoul. There was a book, High Flyers, which was made into a movie, Flying High. I don't know if you saw it.
Yeah, right.
Considerably changed the plot, but anyway, probably wouldn't do that. And then the other basketball book I wrote was a couple of years ago. Now, actually, more like 5 or 6. It's called Marvelous: The Brett Maher Story, and probably for a single thing that I'm most proud of in basketball, it would be that book. I think I managed to tell Brett's story, but weave it into the history of the 36ers and therefore the history of the NBL and the period that he was in it and just before he got into it, so that there was context. You know, it's funny when you write a book like that, Mike. I've got daughters who are adults now, but when I was writing that, at one point I was writing about Brett's father who served in Vietnam, and just over dinner I was talking to the girls and they were saying, what part are you working on now? I said, oh, about Brett's dad in Vietnam, and they said, what's Vietnam? And I sort of thought, wow, you know, I grew up with the Vietnam War, but here I have a couple of kids that were born after 1990 who have no idea what the Vietnam War is. So again, when I was writing about Brett's father, Les, I had to put that into a context of what the Vietnam War was. And the more you do that, the more the book becomes richer and fuller. And I really enjoyed the book. I'm really proud of that. If I leave or have nothing else that I've ever contributed to the game, but I have Marvelous, I think that's pretty marvelous. I'm really, really happy with that. So anybody that's watching this who doesn't have a copy, get in touch. I've still got some books here I can give you.
and the other piece of non-fiction that you
I've written
did?
I've written a novel which at the moment you can only get through Amazon because my publishers are based in Houston, in Texas. And so at this particular point, we're still working out when it's going to be released here in Australia in the bookshops. But you can get it on Amazon. It's had some very nice reviews, and it's a Brett, the bugger, was interviewing me at a dinner recently and called it a love story or a romance novel or something, which, I mean, nothing could be further from the truth, but there is romance in it. But it's a very hard book to describe. There's aftermath of sort of things that happened in the Second World War and how they influence and inform a couple of major relationships that go on and through the book. It's got a bit of fantasy, it's got a bit of harsh reality. It's a really hard genre to describe, which is probably why my publishers are still trying to work out what section of the bookstore it should go in. I think just put it in comedy, that'll do.
Well, buddy, I think the idea of you being a romantic novelist is, I'm not sure it's going to haunt me, but I think I'll go to bed with that idea in mind. Buddy, you've won numerous Writer of the Year awards, both for the NBL and the WNBA. You've won accolades for feature articles. So I think what would be appropriate if we just do a motley run around at random, basically, of the first things that you think about. For example, when we talk about the beginnings of the NBL.
I just remember the excitement and the togetherness of all the clubs in wanting to produce something fantastic. The 1979, the league was called the National Invitation Basketball League because they didn't feel they had the right to call themselves the NBL at that stage, although the Australian Basketball Federation signed off on that, and from 1980 they did call themselves the NBL. But that initial feeling, I was lucky enough to be in attendance at the second meeting of the clubs as they organised the season. There was a meeting in a hangar. The story goes of all the clubs in an airport hangar in Sydney that in 78 where it all began, and then in 79, just before it was launched, Ken Richardson actually invited me along with the West Adelaide delegation and to sit in that room with all these people from clubs from across Australia, and the excitement and the togetherness. They knew they were onto something and they were doing something good, and to be a part of that, even peripherally, was very exciting. And I've got to say, I see similarities between that period and with this demerger that's happened, because the clubs at the moment seem to be working very much together off the floor. I'm sorry if that's too long on it.
No, no, that's all right, because actually what it did, it just jogged my memory. I was involved with one of the foundation teams, Noarlunga City Tigers of Glenelg, and Alan Dorr was the head coach and was on Australian duty, so I had to coach the team up in Brisbane. And Alan said to me, "Look, they've got this quite a sharp guard up there, but if you're just working from baseline to baseline, you get tired, and he might get 30 on you." But so I had David Smythe and a few other people working on this guy called Cal Bruton, and at the end of the game, he got a mere 70 points. So that was basically my introduction to NBL coaching. This little guy that was just unstoppable, just amazing. And in that time, I still think there are a couple of players that wear the mantle of having the most impact the quickest. So in your mind, early 80s or through the 80s, most impact American player?
Well, through the 80s, without any shadow of a doubt, there's Leroy Loggins, and then there's Daylight. But after that, that next tier has got the James Crawfords and another bunch of great players. Leroy just will stand out for all time for me because he did everything, and the pleasure he got playing, it was so evident on him how much fun he was having. He could beat you from the three-point line before there was a three-point line, and certainly after there was. He could take you to the basket. He had mid-range. He could throw down dunks. He could tip dunk. He stole the ball in the lanes. He had long arms. He harassed people defensively. He was prepared to sacrifice his game if someone else was going well to get him the ball. He was just a consummate basketball player, and without any shadow of a doubt, he stands for mine as the best basketball player we've had in the NBL, 80s, 90s, any era. Leroy stands apart. So then there's that next tier of Cal Brutons and James Crawfords, and then and Benny Lewis. There's actually so many of them that you tend to forget about that made such a big contribution in that period. And of course, a standout was Rocky Smith, who played 2 years in our league and was just such a fantastic player. How he's not in the Hall of Fame, well, I know how he's not, because he only played 2 years in our league. But in those 2 years, he dominated to the extent that that's why Al Green was recruited by West Adelaide, so that they would have an answer to Rocky Smith. In 1980, there was a West Adelaide St Kilda grand final. St Kilda won comfortably, and Ken Richardson, I remember him saying, we need to get a Rocky Smith, and that was Al Green. Now, Al made an enormous impact when he first arrived. He filled up Apollo Stadium because of the things he could do, and he could do them at such speed. Best compliment I've ever heard for Al comes from a fellow Hall of Famer, Darryl Pearce, who was running around playing for your team, Mike, when you were coaching the Adelaide City Eagles and the original Adelaide 36ers. When Darryl would say that the team would come in and play Adelaide on the Saturday, then they'd play West Adelaide on the Sunday, and Darryl said he was happy to go and buy a ticket so that he could watch Al Green play. And that, from a Hall of Famer, to say that about someone who'd become his teammate, and then they would win a championship together, I don't think you can get much better praise than that. There was just so many of these guys that we almost took them all for granted. There was such talent, and now when you look back over the last decade, you go, wow, there's one or two or three you can pluck out, and most of the Americans that we've had were role players that fit what the team needed. In those days, we had absolute stars, but Leroy is Leroy, and then there is everybody else.
I do remember. I do remember Al Green when he first came out here, and people have forgotten that. You may remember his first nickname was Dr. Duncanstein, and he only became Mean Al Green once that smashing dunking ability with age had sort of dissipated a little. But I remember him for sheer physicality, doing a Michael Jordan, take off from the foul line over a 7-foot Steve Wallace to dunk the ball.
He was so amazing. Yeah, and even now, if you can find, there's some footage in the documentary that Lennon Cooper made of the 80s, the golden era. There's still some footage there of Al coming down the floor at full speed and just doing a back turn at such a wicked speed that you go, how did he not lose control of the ball? And this was, we're talking about 84, 85, 86, that particular period of time. He was a standout. And then, you know, towards the end of the era, you get Mark Davis. Now you tend to forget how dominant Mark Davis was. But the difference between a Mark Davis and an Al Green was that Al, again, was a player that could do pretty much anything. Mark was just this rebounding machine who would, I don't know why people didn't just block the hell out of him, but he always seemed to find his way to the best position for the rebound, and he would put it away. And he had a nice mid-range, and as he got older and less capable inside the keyway, he got more capable outside the keyway. He became a three-point shooter. He developed that. You know, I have utmost respect for Mark and what he did in his career. But for pure basketball ability and what he could do, you can't really touch Al. Al was sensational. Which takes you to that 82 West Adelaide team, and you go, there's Al Green at the height of his powers, an MVP of the league. There's Leroy Loggins, still becoming the best player that I'd seen in our league, and an MVP, three-time MVP. There's Ken Richardson, an MVP, the first MVP in All-Star 5, first All-Star 5 in 1980. He was in that too. And then you added an Olympian like Peter Ali from 1980. That was, and Brad Dalton, another Olympian, and Ray Wood. That was just one heck of a team. Fun to watch.
It is, and I can see, Boti, that we're going to have to maybe cut this into 2 and 3 because we haven't even scratched the surface yet. So can we just get through without glossing over too much? But the coach of the 1980s, maybe if you can just give us quick coaches of the 80s, 90s, and 1000s, and a couple of players from each generation, and we haven't even touched on the WNBL.
Well, we can do that. Well, let's do the 80s now, because I think Ken Richardson as a player was very highly regarded, but as a coach, I don't think he gets the respect that he's due. In South Australia, he won 5 straight state titles. You coached at state level too.
Yeah.
Like, you know how he used to win 1, win 2, win 5 in a row. You know, you can say, well, he had the talent, but name a team that's won a championship that didn't.
You still have
talent.
to win them.
That's right. It's sort of a moot point. And then in his 4-year record with West Adelaide, they were, I believe, 4th, 2nd, 1st, and 3rd, or something of that nature. They were never lower than 4th. They won a championship. It was 1, 2, 3, 4 in the 4 years in some other order. It was a pretty fine coaching career, and I really enjoyed dealing with him as a media person, dealing with him as a coach. Obviously, there was yourself as the inaugural coach of the 36ers. I don't think you get a lot of the credit that you're due for that difficult period of throwing a team together when Forestville pulled out just before the start of that 82 season, and the State Association coming together and putting this composite team together and saying, okay, Mike, good luck with that. And in the 3 years that you had them, I'm pretty sure they did not have a single year with a losing record. So that was a fair achievement. Then we move on to Ken Cole, whose flamboyance and his larger-than-life personality, it speaks for itself. And his 2 years, they were grand finalists and set a bunch of records. And the second year, they were champions and pretty much invincible. 24-2, 2 games lost on the buzzer only. So 10 seconds away from the 26-0 season. An amazing group. That was. The 80s was just such great fun. And then the 90s, we sort of lulled for a fair while. We had a few coaches that, probably weren't really up to the job or weren't really aware of what it really required. And then we got Mike Dunlap, who was a terrific coach of young men, but probably didn't understand the psyche of the older professional athlete. And that's where he was butting heads in the end with the older players, and he's enjoyed a very successful career back in the US in college, and then he had his one little pro stint, and it went much the same way as it ended in Adelaide, which is a shame because Mike had an extraordinary basketball IQ and great ideas for how the game should be played. I didn't agree with a lot of his ideas, but they were good ideas and fresh and different. So we're moving on to the 90s, and we go. Phil Smythe arrives, and the opening night, his first game as coach, he comes out and he's introduced, and he gets this standing ovation. It goes for a solid 2 minutes. Now, when you say 2 minutes, it doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're introduced and the fans start applauding, and after that 10 seconds of applause, it usually dies down. It keeps going, and it keeps going, and it keeps going. And I mean, he was so humbled. I've talked to him about that subsequently. He was like, he didn't know what to do. He didn't know whether to wave or say, okay, please, I haven't done anything yet. But the fans were just so happy to have him, and he rewarded them back with championships in his first 2 years and 3 championships in his first 5. That was, again, a great period, and that was the emergence of Brett Maher, who's our greatest homegrown player of the NBL era. We're pretty much up to speed, or?
Well, we are, Boti, but we've sort of left out the rest of Australia. But I think we're going to have to come back on that.
I'm sorry, I thought you wanted me to focus on here.
No, because Brian Kill is going to watch this over in Thailand.
Is he?
And he's going to come back to us and say, listen, guys, there's more in basketball outside of Adelaide. So
he knows there isn't. In Brisbane, let me tell you. Again, that gets back to that thing, isn't it? If you don't have an NBL presence, people think your sport's not going well. Now, Brian and Bobby Turner were those great entrepreneurial coaches who didn't just coach and do that very well, which they did, but also were able to attract sponsors and fans and get people passionate about a game they didn't really know much about. I mean, what Brian achieved initially at St Kilda and then again in Brisbane has never been duplicated. He had the team playing at the Boonville Entertainment Centre, which was pretty much out at the boondocks, but they were getting 13,000 people there for a period of time, and that's unheard of when you go now. Well, Brisbane doesn't even have a team, so how important was Brian in that process? Absolutely essential, absolutely the key ingredient. There was Brian.
Boti, I do have first-hand memories of that. I mean, the last game I ever coached in National League was as far back as 1987. The last game was against Brisbane at Boondall, and there were over 10,000 people there.
Yeah.
Now, to the stage where they don't have a team, let alone a supporter base, seems quite unbelievable from those sorts of heady days that they experienced.
Yeah, and it's an NBL priority, and as it should be, to re-establish a presence in Brisbane, and probably with the name too. There's some debate now about the name Bullets, whether it reflects something poor, but I don't think in Australia it does. I think in America it does, but I don't think in Australia it does. We don't have that gun culture, but that's a conversation for another time. There were many great and entertaining coaches that I had to deal with. There was the late great Charlie Emmett, who once famously said, with Ken Cole's team when they were coming down to play, I think his Hobart team, I think he was coaching Hobart at the time, even though he was a Sydney man himself, where he said, we're going to hold them to 70 points. And Ken Cole said, which half? And he was right. He was right. They absolutely blew him off the floor.
Yeah.
There was lots of great coaches, and then we have the next year when Melbourne Tigers come in, and that brings in that culture and that history of success in the VBA and the SEBL, SEC, all that sort of stuff with Lindsay and the Melbourne Tigers, who once upon a time were Melbourne Church, and I remember them as Melbourne Church. They were quite fearsome back in the 60s and early 70s. They were a great club. So, I don't know who else you want me to talk about. We move on to the 90s. I guess I have stayed here.
No, look, that's all right. I think what we've done is opened up the door for some other conversations, particularly about the national scene, national personalities, national players, the way it's gone. The last question, I guess, Boti, is that I know that as a coach, my passion lasted for a certain amount of time, and then it became quite difficult. But here, 40 years later, you still have the passion for the game. What's the deal?
I'm an idiot. I've just never grown up, I guess. I just feel a connection to the sport that I was pretty much born with. Like I said, I had all these great people, great sportsmen and women in our backyard as I was growing up, and yeah, I just love the thing, and the best thing about it, Mike, is it's always different. There's always something different going on. There's always someone new to admire. There's, like in the preseason, Melbourne Tigers had a player by the name of Stephen Dennis, an import who sadly suffered a season-ending injury. I just watched him play a game. I think it was against Cairns or Wollongong, but he made this move where he attacked the basket from the wing, and he just did an onside dribble, but it was just so good that it had one defender went that way, one defender went that way, one defender broke his ankles, and he was just laying it up. And I haven't seen that before live from that individual. The way he did it, it's still very exciting. It's exciting for me to know that James Ennis is coming to town on Friday. I get to speak with him tomorrow. He's going to be here on Friday. I want to see what he's going to bring. I'm excited by that. So I guess because of the turnover of players over time and the thrill of being able to watch a Brett Maher as a kid run onto that court for the first time, then as an adult and a sage, wonderful basketball player, wave his farewell. The thrill to be able to write that entire career, and Rachel Spawns and so many others. I mean, I've got to talk mainly about South Australians because that's where I'm based, but now I get the opportunity to write about Wertho and Damien Martin and Tess Madgen and lots of other people. The opportunity to do that is wonderful, and they're all so different. They all bring something different. So no, the passion won't go. The day the passion goes, and it did wane a little bit in the last 3 years, the day the passion goes is the day that it's time to hang up the keyboard, take the keyboard and go, okay, you're up, it's done. Somebody else needs to take over and run with it.
Boti, I think people now are aware that of your blog and going to it in quite large numbers, but you and I have indicated that we want to have a number of conversations with basketball people, coaches, players, past players, current players, men, women. Can you give us a bit of a snapshot of where you think conversations with Boti will go? And maybe you can explain why you called your blog Basketball on the Internet.
Oh, really? Seriously? because that sort of basketball, B-on-O-D-T, Internet, I-B-O-T-I, is actually my first name. You see the connection?
Very clever.
You see what I did there? But you know, it's been on the website since it began. I think probably half a dozen people out of the very many I've been lucky enough to have come in have ever made that connection. I've actually started to make that connection for them lately because this year the NBL isn't awarding a Player of the Week, so we've got the BOTI Player of the Week award, and I think people have gone, I've made that connection. but what I'd like to do is to get some of our Australian personnel that are playing all around the world, whether that's Aaron Phillips playing in Poland or Joe Ingles playing in Israel, Patty Mills playing in San Antonio. I'd love to get them into this situation where we can just have a chat, where I'll just fire up some questions at them and we'll just have a chat. I mean, usually people are able to see the end result of a chat. I mean, I don't really have a lot of interviews with players and coaches. I have chats with them, and then I just take down the notes that I think the public is going to find most interesting. So that's what I want to do. I want to present just the conversations the way I do an interview, and you basically I've only ever gone into interviews with about two or three questions, and then the rest I'll let the person talk, and we'll see where that takes us. And I've found that over 40 years, it's taken me to some wonderfully interesting places.
And I think the other thing we need to point out to people is if they have suggestions of particular people they wish to listen to, that all they need to do is submit by email their suggestions, and we'll certainly follow them up.
Yeah, and questions
to reference.
When you know who we're doing, when we sort of advertise like this week, we've got player A. If you want to ask that person, or would like me to ask that person a couple of questions, I'm happy to throw them at them. Absolutely, get involved.
Okay. Thanks, Boti. And we'll be on board very, very shortly to pursue this conversation.
Okay. Look forward
Thanks,
to it,
Boti.
Mike. Thank you.